Greetings, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome.
Yes, good afternoon. Um, I would like to welcome you to our fifth lecture of Decolonial Now online lecture series on interdisciplinary perspectives on coloniality and decoloniality. Um, Today, Professor Faisal Garba from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, will deliver a lecture on contemporary capitalism and the coloniality of labor migration. Um, so by focusing mainly on the migrant workers and their vulnerabilities, he will critically examine the intertwined relations between capitalist accumulation and coloniality of labor. Um, Faisal Garba is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and Associate Professor of Sociology, Migration, and Mobility at the Africa Institute in Sharjah, United Arab Emirates. So he's been working on migration, inequality, and working class forms of organizing and social theory as well. Um, Faisal obtained his education from several universities in several countries, including the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, universities of Ghana, Legon, University of Cape Town, and also University of Freiburg in Germany. And throughout his career, he has held fellowships at various like well-known prominent institutions, such as the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape in South Africa, the Post-Growth Society College at the University of Vienna in Germany, the Department of Economic Geography and Institute of African Studies at the University of Bayreuth, again in Germany, the Marian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa at the University of Ghana, and the Center for the Study of Social Systems at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India. So he has conducted extensive field work in various countries, again, in Germany, in Ghana, India, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and then United States of America. So I would like to invite Faisal now to deliver his lecture. Please.
Greetings once again, and thank you very much, Professor Chelik, for the invitation, and thank you very much, colleagues, for joining. It is a privilege to be part of this lecture series, having seen some of the activities of decoloniality now, especially around 2003. I remember the conference held in Freiburg where there was a workshop. So it's really nice to see how the initiative has grown. So what I'm really going to do has been set out by Aiju. So in a sense, I could as well just say, okay, Dito, done. Good evening. But I'll just speak a little bit since Aiju has asked me to speak. And just one disclaimer, I am slideless in this presentation, so I don't have a slide. So I will just speak from my notes and hopefully the point would be the engagement with the colleagues that are here. So the first point that I want to make is an obvious one, that there has been this significant shift in terms of the organization of labor, uh, and therefore the site of accumulation, towards what we may call platform work. If you think of the transportation/taxi industry, e-hailing, digital work, and the apparent points that we see from that is that there's been a transformation in the organization of the labor process itself. If you think of how people work, the idea of an office, has significantly been transformed for many people. COVID was really crucial in that moment, the home office, working from home and so on. But in relation to this transformation is a shift in the ability of workers to organize uh, and therefore to push back against egregious working conditions, to expand rights. Erju, for example, as some of you here may know, did a fantastic work on street traders in Durban and kind of the ability to mobilize, organize outside of union structures that are used to full-time working hours. Now, this transformation in the nature, the labor process, worker organization has direct relationship with the concentration of wealth. Yanis Varoufakis, I'm sure all of us know, has this recent book where he was making the argument around how, the, if you like, enclosure of the digital by a handful of human beings. You think of your Zuckerberg, your Musks, and so on, has created an kind of zone of massive accumulation in things that have really become socially necessary services that we need today. You can imagine what it means to live without the internet. We will not be able to have this meeting today, but kind of ownership structures means that a handful of people control that. Now, capitalism needs social engineering for a number of purposes. Firstly, you need to supply labor on an ongoing basis, but more so in a colonial situation. So in a classical colonial situation, the procurement of labor on an ongoing basis is really important, right? If you think of, say, settler colonies, South Africa would be one obvious example, where you had a competition between mines and plantations for labor. And the colonial state now had to mediate between these two capitalist camps in terms of how do you allocate labor, but more importantly, how do you procure the labor in the first place? So to ensure labor supply, social engineering becomes important, statecraft becomes important, ideologies become important. Now, this, of course, guarantees profit because, in a labor-intensive capitalist arrangement, without supply of labor, then you cannot think of making any form of profit. But also, you need to undercut resistance and organization by workers, right? So this social engineering means that you have to make sure that workers who are highly exploited, paid very little, discriminated on gender, on racial, on ethnic lines, do not come together, to organize as a whole and therefore push back. So things like ethnicity becomes important, racial identity becomes important. And here I want to make the point that if you think of some of the earliest use of the category race, for example, in Europe, it was really used to differentiate between those who were of upper, quote unquote, social standing versus the lower lot. So in a sense, the very earliest uses of race outside of kind of this anthropological colonial works that define people, including fauna and flora, was the need to differentiate human beings based on social standing. But this social engineering had a particular marker in a colonial context, right? So here, it wasn't just the question of race, which was also important in settler colonies. If you think of the United States, you think of Canada, you think of Algeria, you think of South Africa, you think of Zimbabwe. So ethnicity is just as important in a normal colonial situation, but race becomes important because here you have a settler population that had come from the metropolis. You also had workers that were procured from other colonies of the colonizing power. So if you think of the forced removal of people from India towards South Africa to work as indentured laborers, right? So this heterogeneity of identity that colonialism mediated enable the differentiation of people based on ethnicity, based on race, based on gender. And this again serves this function that I made earlier, which is to undercut resistance and organization by workers. So the point I'm trying to make here is that active creation, cultivation, and instrumentalization or capitalization, deliberately pun intended, of gender, ethnicity, and race is not incidental to capitalism. It's actually co-constitutive to capitalism. There's a work by a colleague, some of you here may know, Jonathan Grossman, who says that, I don't know of any of any capitalism that does not actively try to be racist where it suits it. Okay. But having made this preliminary point, I think we have to then come back to what is contemporary capitalism? What do I mean by contemporary capitalism in this presentation, and how does it relate to the coloniality of labor migration? Now, by contemporary capitalism, really, I mean the dominant or increasingly dominating means of both production and accumulation. And in the present phase, mainly represented by the shift towards the digital, the shift towards the deterritorialized factory, which is often not a site, but actually a network of people. But in particular, what we all know from our Ubers to our delivery people, every major kind of city now has one form of even a localized delivery system for food, groceries, and other things. So this dominant or increasingly dominant means of production, I trace to the late 1970s. Really, for me, that's the beginning of it. People like David Harvey, in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, I think do a good work in showing the emergence of this. And here I think of the 1970s, when this idea of kind of a new liberalism, or what later came to be known as neoliberalism, became dominant. Both one as a result of processes of the production of ideas in terms of how you think of the relationship between economy and society, how you regulate or do not regulate the economy and society. But then this was giving a political push with the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. Now, before these important political developments, you had this idea of a so-called social compact, or what came to be known as tripartite governance of the economy, where capital, the state, and labor reach a supposed win-win situation. So if you think of South Africa post-apartheid, you have something called NEDLAC. Many social democratic societies have this process where you try to tame capital by embedding it, what people call embedded liberalism, so that you do not have massive profit rates that completely outstrip people's buying capacity. But more importantly, you want to make sure that certain basic social necessities are available, the social wages provided, and the state mediates that process. But this is really predicated on the ability of corporations to keep making profits. And the embedded liberalism was really built on the back of a Cold War center-peripheral relationship of accumulation, where you had these economies in the so-called third world that remain extractive, that are disarticulated, meaning you have an economy which produces, say, gold, timber, or cocoa, but there's no processing, there's no connection within the economy. It's outwardly tilted, right? So, and there's major corporations centered in the north, basically extract these resources, the pushback by working classes in the metropoles that are also oppressed, that are also massively exploited, at least tames the ability of these corporations to keep this profits for themselves alone. But you see, once you begin to have low profit rates and the militancy of workers, and here I think of the mine worker struggle in the United Kingdom and the defeat of that struggle, because it was an important moment, and how that really led to an unfettered brand of capitalism. And related to that is the question of ideas, and this is why what we're doing here is important. I mean, Milton Friedman and the students around him were really propagating this idea. about the need to have a free reign for capital, that capital has been hemmed in by a series of legislations and laws that, accompanied this embedded nature of capitalism. So in a sense, this brief history that I'm trying to lay out of what I mean by contemporary capitalism, if we think of the works of the German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, her concept of Landnahme, both here Landnahme in terms of the capture of territory, actual land, but actually the commodification of what was previously commons. Okay, so if you think of struggles in many parts of the world around access to water as a right, as opposed to water as a commodity, land is really crucial in this because as a major means of production, but also as a site of people's identification, identity formation, land becomes a major site of struggle where you have various groups of, capital, whether it's mining, but also speculative capital, which needs land as basically a collateral to play with on stock markets, begin to have this contestation. So I use Landnahme here, not necessarily in the classical sense in which Rosa Luxemburg uses it, but really both in terms of the expansion of territory, the kind of typical colonial expansion of territory, but also ideas about expansion of territory of accumulation that also get transposed even in societies that do not have classical kind of colonial relationship. Now, the tail end of this embedded liberalism was, of course, the financialization of the economy. And we all remember this idea of the need to make labor more competitive, right-sizing, the commercialization of different parts of the public sector, outsourcing, minimum wage. I think in Germany, for Germans, you remember the Hartz reforms, Hartz IV, and so on. These were all really part of this larger package. Now, this need to make labor competitive simply means, a battle for ground zero, starvation wages that really cannot even reproduce the worker to enable her or him to go to work the next day. And this is where the crucial point of the coloniality comes into play and where gender becomes important here, especially in non-Western societies, that women increasingly bore the brunt of social reproduction on a massive scale, so that these lower wages that can ordinarily not sustain the worker sustains the worker because women do this unpaid extra labor. And so vulnerability become normalized. I mean, we all remember the works of Guy Standing, the precariat, precariousness, both in terms of the non-standardized, but de facto standardized working conditions, piecework. Indeed, when I was doing my PhD, I spoke with some women, mainly from Africa, who work in different if you see a McDonald's, for example, for those who are in Freiburg next to, if you go to the Hauptbahnhof, there's a McDonald's there. And you might just see a woman from, I don't know, the DRC or from Benin, in the washroom cleaning it. Now, in the African community in Germany, they call it Dankeschön Arbeit or Dankeschön work. Now, these women are actually not paid by anybody, right? So essentially what happens is that you have some contractor who would go and get this quote unquote contract from McDonald's, from H&M or so. And this woman would have to then pay that contractor. They buy the detergent, they clean the toilet. Now their wage is really dependent on the kindness of the patron of a toilet. So if you decide to give them €1, €2, and this is where the Dankeschön comes and say, oh, thank you. So essentially this women's labor has been commodified, but for free. So I call it the free commodification of labor. The labor has been commodified, but there's no wage attached to it, right? So in a sense, a labor relation is now turned into a relationship of if you like, philanthropy. It's almost like you are helping them when you pay, but actually that is not what is happening because McDonald's is in a sense their employer, but really not their employer. So in a sense, this labor force, like these women, like your delivery people, become easily exploitable, easily replaceable, easily abused. And and here I want to come back to some work that we did in South Africa during COVID. Erjo, how am I doing with time? Okay. So okay, during COVID, where we're trying to understand one, both the exposure of delivery persons, those who had to do the socially necessary function, but also the representation of these people in terms of representation in a typical sense of how their rights are defended, how their working conditions are defended, but also their view, the way in which they're represented by the state, by dominant sections of society. So here, these people, mainly migrants from the rest of the continent, a lot of them from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, sorry, from neighboring countries around South Africa, you know, who had to go out at the height of COVID to deliver food, to deliver medication, you just sit and order. A lot of them got COVID. A lot of them got COVID, right? But the discourse of the state was that they were the vectors, they were the carriers of COVID. These people were spreading COVID, these migrants moving around. But at the same time, these were the people that were indispensable to the survival of many middle classes. Those of us who were Zooming and teaching our students during COVID, we were not going out, but we were eating at home while those people were outside. Now, here, what often happens is that tropes, stereotypes about the illegal, the dirty, the law-breaking colonized other, meaning here the black person that apartheid South Africa deployed, was actually appropriated by black people, white people, whoever in South Africa, and then imposed on the migrant worker. Okay, so here the migrant worker is an archetype in the context of flexible work, in the context of delivery work. So it doesn't really matter who is doing the stereotyping. It could be a black person, but often a middle class. So it's almost like a class position, right? But which is superimposed on a racialized identity. So here, what I'm trying to carefully say is that it's not a clear-cut kind of racialized situation where people who are race A versus people who are race B, A meaning the dominant group, therefore racializing the other. No, it's actually about class position here, so that people who may actually be racialized themselves but are occupying a certain class position, then racialize those that are below them. So the figure of the delivery person under COVID in South Africa, but also in the place where I'm currently doing a number of ethnographic work in the Gulf region, because these are societies that are predominantly dominated by migrants. Some Gulf societies actually have what? Only 11% local population, right? So 89% migrants. Okay, these are the people that do the delivery. These are the people that build the roads, the construction. Okay, but these are also the people that are the racialized other. These are the people that have to be controlled. These are the unruly workers. These are the undisciplined workers. And often this is an appropriation of colonial stereotypes, colonial epithets, and so on. So the point that I'm trying to make is that while on the one hand, we have a certain assumption that the digitalized sphere, the moment of digital labor would replace people, automation, and so on, and that it actually provides a certain opening for freedom, if you like. I think Germany is a major pioneer in this regard. I remember there was this moment in Germany where you had the concept of Ich AG, right? In a sense, me incorporated, you basically become an enterprise in yourself, and you have all kinds of motivational speakers. And today we call them influencers, that basically tell you, you can make it, you just have to set up your corporation, people marketing things on WhatsApp and so on. Essentially, what really happens is that relationship of relationship of employment, of labor have been not just deterritorialized, but they become impersonal. Okay. So that now people basically see themselves as agents, of the generation of value. People are now seeing themselves as failures if they're not able to make it, so the whole entrepreneurial self, it's a whole ideology of the entrepreneurial self. But the danger here, though, I think is twofold, and I'll try and end here. One is that it weakens solidarity, okay? Because the bigger picture is missing here. You fragment as much as possible. And if we think of the current moment, and this is where I want to end, the massive right-wing mobilization. Recently, I saw somebody sent me a picture of, I'm sure you all know at least the Germans, the BSW, Bundeswehrwagenknecht, and it was like, Germany needs less migration. And I understand how the German working class has really been squeezed, prices of basic goods have gone up, but just like in the US, the idea that you have the Mexican, you have the Syrian, the African, the Turkish, who's here illegally, who is the reason why wages are going down, who is the reason why you cannot afford the basic necessity. A classical trope, displaces people's attention from really what the core issues are, which is that the public sector is shrinking. You have massive inequality as a result of accumulation in the digital moment by this handful of billionaires, largely based in the US, and therefore working people, even those who are actually at work and those who are unemployed, that have to come together, begin to see the reality of the present configuration of the economy, actually spent their time thinking of how to other each other, how to push each other out. Okay. And this for me is really crucial in terms of it's not just about understanding coloniality as something in the past, but really it's a set of relations, it's a structural location that people find themselves. Okay. And in the context of the economy, really, it's not just a fixed category which is racialized or gendered, it's a shifting category which draws on tropes, which draws on stereotypes. Okay. So for me, the larger political question is what is to be done, meaning how do we understand this current moment, not just as a populist right-wing moment, but really as a particular moment of the fusion of economic power and political power that draws on racialized colonial relationship, and labor is at the heart of it. So what kind of a new working class politics, which is aware and conscious of racialization and coloniality, do we need? And here I just want to end by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist thinker, where his work on hegemony I think is really important. So what kind of counter movements, both at the ideational and practical political level, do we need to push back, against this hegemony of the other, of the migrant as the source of the crisis? So Eju, I don't know how I'm doing with time. I don't know if I have exhausted my time. I have two more things to say, but I'm happy to come back to that.
Please continue. We still have
Okay.
time.
Okay. So here, what has remained constant in the moment of the digitalized capitalist world is that migrant workers' vulnerabilities are both tools and strategies of accumulation. Now, what do I mean by that? One of our students, Erju, and I just finished a really brilliant master's thesis, and again on platform work, delivery, and so on. Now, from that work, but also other work that we've done on this question, is that from the algorithm to the means of recruitment, people's residency status, people's quote unquote social situation within the places that they live, one serves as a way to exploit them the more. Because if you do not, for example, have the right to work full time, if you are a student, you can only work, for example, 20 hours, right? But often, as we know in this industry, many people are able to work beyond the allowable limits. but actually what they even get in terms of wages becomes reduced because of their migrancy status. And I'll give you an example. I've done some work with some of these delivery people around Frankfurt, and maybe the person is supposed to earn 10 euros per hour. Now, of course, they do not have proper documents. They work, I don't know, 14 hours, but then they are paid, say, 7 euros, right? But even the 7 euros, when it comes to actually paying them, the actual amount that gets to them might be, if you distribute it across hours, could actually be 5 euros. But they have nowhere to go, right? One, you are illegal. You do not have the proper right of stay, and secondly, you are vulnerable on a number of levels because of the global situation at the moment. You have lots of dependents where you come from. People are waiting for your next paycheck in order to pay school fees and so on, right? So this inequality, which makes it possible, right, for certain parts of the world, that have very, very low rates to again have very high living conditions, expenditure rather, levels, means that people have to make do with this situation that they face. So here, vulnerability due to migrancy is not like an abnormality. It is an integral part of the accumulation process, because the more vulnerable, the more exploitable a person becomes, and therefore from them you are likely to extract more profit. And you can really go back to the question of colonial capitalist expansion to the so-called third world, right? Because here you had a labor regime where people were at the beginning not paid. They were actually forced to go and work on mines and plantations as a result of the statecraft that I referred to earlier, which is poll tax, hard tax. So people have to pay these taxes. So they have to engage in the cash economy. So you go and work in order to pay your taxes. But in that process, you become really an agent of massive accumulation because there's very little expenditure to even reproduce that labor itself. That labor is working in order to pay tax to the colonial state, and at the same time, it is making it possible for the colonial company, because that's often how this colonial capitalist enterprises got into the third world, is called kind of this East India company, does that company. And so finally, when I say this colonially derived notion of migrancy associated with vulnerability underpin accumulation in contemporary capitalist accumulation, what do I mean? So what I'm trying to say here is that normally human beings move around. Mobility is integral to being human. Okay, it's normal. So many, I'm sure in Germany, many young people just finish high school and they take a gap year. They want to travel. It's just what I always say: the legs are not meant for sitting. We need the legs to move. We're made to move, right? But then, in a certain sense, for some people, mobility movement becomes abnormal. It becomes a crime. Okay, so the migrancy of some people becomes a crime, right? Now, this becomes a crime because at the expansion of the colonial capitalist state, you needed fixed supply of labor. You needed that assurance that people will go and work. So therefore, the colonial statecraft meant that identity was fused to place. So you are Erju, you're supposed to be in Freiburg. This is your name. Freiburg becomes your world. Why? Because we need to make sure that when we need you to go and work in Stuttgart, we know where to find you. Okay. So this notion of associating identity with place ensures that you can control the mobility of people. When they move outside of the radius that you assign to them, they've committed a crime. Okay. So this was therefore transposed not just in the sites of colonial conquest, but actually even in the metropolis relative to the relationship of the labor of those that were colonized. Okay, so they only come to the metropolis when they are needed, when they are asked to come. So you think of the Windrush generation in the UK, you think of the Gastarbeiter. We go to sign a contract to bring you here, but when you come, although you are needed because of an aging population, which when you come beyond a certain number, you are an illegal immigrant. So here, I just want to emphasize the close connection between statecraft the history of statecraft and the assignment of identity in the colonial moment and how that shapes contemporary states, whether they are in the metropolis or in the periphery of capitalism, but also how that is constantly used as a way to recruit, as a way to exploit, as a way to deny or to give rights. So I hope I have been able to at least start some conversation points and that we would have some debates, questions, and disagreements. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Faisal, for this insightful and really informative lecture.